All right, hello. Hi. All right, it's 1:30, so I want to try to get started because I'm trying to cram a lot of information into here. So thanks everyone for coming. I want to start actually by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Indigenous owners from Canada, which is it's a tradition they have in Australia as well. They never forget to do. I'm Adam Griffin, and this is healing trauma from the perspectives of several Indigenous cultures, and that's why I'm going to try to get through as much as I can here in this 75 minutes. But there's a 30-minute break in the schedule right after this, so I'm happy to stay afterwards if anyone has more questions and wants to talk. So my background, I graduated from Rice University last May, or a year ago May, in 2015. I majored in psychology and sports medicine. I've been teaching yoga for 4 years. I'm originally from Chicago. And I'm currently traveling on Rice University's Zeff Fellowship, which is a one-year grant for international independent research. So for my topic, which I proposed, is Indigenous healing practices with a focus on mind-body practices. There will be a little bit of talk of spirituality and herbs, but I'm focusing on the mind-body, like my two majors. I want to say a few thank yous first. So thank you to Rice University and Professor Zeff especially for funding all my work this year. I'm actually still on this year. I'm in month 11 out of 12. I get to go home in August. I'm pretty excited. Thanks to Bruce Perry for letting me talk at this conference and share all this information with you. Thanks to Annette Jackson and Barry Street and everyone who was so welcoming to me in Australia when I was there back in the fall, and as well Dr. David Clark, who's not here. I don't know if he wants me to call him doctor, but he's a smart man, and he was really nice to me when I was there. And thanks to my parents who flew in from Chicago to see this talk, so thank you. So this is everywhere I've been since August 1st, and this is a map of all the flights I've taken so far. So I'm going to be talking about first South African traditional healing. I started in South Africa. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Aboriginal healing perspectives in Australia. Although I'm going to spend a little bit less time on that one. There's people in this room that know way more about that than I do, and I have a lot of dense information to try to get to in some of the other ones. I then spent 4 months in India learning Zen Shiatsu and traditional Chinese medicine theory. And I'm going to talk about Ayurveda, which is the Indian wellness philosophy, I guess, and Reiki, which is a Japanese energetic healing practice. For each topic, I'm going to talk about the general healing philosophy, because not all of these are always specifically targeted to trauma, and that's not my explicit focus this year, but for the purposes of this conference. Then I'm going to apply each practice to trauma, and then I'm going to talk about my own personal experiences, what seemed to work, what didn't. It'll be a little less scientific, but that's the value of actually going out and doing it. So I ask that you please hold questions to the end, and like I said, I'm happy to stay afterwards, but if I don't get to some topics at all, then it'll be I have a lot to get through is my point. So South Africa, the two main types of healers you'll find in South Africa are the Sangomas and the Inyangas. And the Sangomas are the diviners and the Inyangas are the herbalists. Those differences are a bit more traditional today. They both do basically a bit of everything. The herbalists still focus on the herbs, especially in the Sangomas, are a bit more spiritual, but you can get a spiritual reading or a future reading from an Inyanga. And just so you understand, over 50% of the population in South Africa still consults these healers today, and they usually consult them in addition to medical doctors. So you wouldn't necessarily go to a Sangoma for a cut. But I talked to an Inyanga, and he said the number one problem he has is marital issues, actually. The main technique of the traditional South African healers is channeling the spiritual ancestors. Spiritual ancestors hold a lot of significance in the culture in general, just in daily life. You'll even hear non-healer South Africans talk about ancestral energy or their ancestors. Generally, what they do is the healers will put themselves into a trance somehow through dance or some form of rhythm, and that will connect them with the spirit world, and then they will receive information from the spiritual ancestors, and then they will relay that to you. That's the advice they give on to you. There's a lot of significance to dreams in the culture, and so they'll ask you about, are you having dreams, what's in them. There's a lot of dream interpretation, and they talk about spells and curses, but I want to say this spirituality is really cultural rather than religious. A lot of the healers themselves are also Christian. So I was in South Africa, and I had a bunch of family friends back at home. I was raised Catholic, and so some of them were praying for my soul, but what they don't realize is actually, as I'll explain in the South African vernacular, when they're praying for me, they're casting a spell on me as well. And so a spell in South African vernacular, or a curse, is just any intention you're sending essentially to someone to change. So if you are, well, here, I'll explain. This is an Inyanga's shelf in downtown Johannesburg, and the item labeled number 1, that's a love potion, it's exactly what you think it is. I talked to the Inyanga, and he said you would drink it, and you would maybe do some kind of rituals with it that the Inyanga would prescribe. That would probably include washing yourself at certain intervals. Although, if you're trying to get a specific date, I recommend you wash yourself at certain intervals regardless. And then I asked, what are those crystals there, number 2? And he said, oh, like when an evil wizard puts a curse on your lawn. And I said, no, I don't know. That's not... I said, we don't have that in Chicago. But actually we do, in the way that they meant it. So a curse is anyone, like I said, who has a bad intention. Whereas if someone's praying for me back at home, that's a good intention they're sending me. So if your neighbor is really jealous of your lawn and wishes bad on you, you can essentially spread those crystals around your lawn to get rid of the negative energy that they keep sending to you. This is a video of, had the privilege of attending a group of Sangomas being filmed for a documentary. And so this is a Sangoma in traditional dance doing a dance with a drum circle to get into a trance, and then he's going to kneel down and start saying what he's hearing from the spirit world and from the spiritual ancestors. So I'm going to play this short clip, and I can talk about it a little bit in a second. So I don't know if you can see, but the woman on the side, as he's talking, is doing kind of an open palmed clap and kind of in a heartbeat rhythm like this. And so when you receive a reading from a Sangoma and Inyanga, they don't always do a full dance like this. They just tend to do something rhythmic. So actually that woman who's doing the clapping, I received a reading from her, and I received a reading from an Inyanga as well. And for example, when she connected to the spirit world, basically lit some herbs or incense in a bowl and kind of inhaled them and then did a clapping rhythm to connect with the spirit world, but she didn't get up and do a full dance like that. So South African healing, as applied to trauma specifically, it's hard to say. It would be individual and contextual. They would probably give you some combination of, like I said, herbs and rituals to perform as you take the herbs, and the treatment would likely be spiritual and physical. It would, probably be a physical ritual that's meant to have spiritual effects. So that bottle on the right, this is terrible advertising for Tango Sport, but when I received a reading from an Inyanga, he made a concoction in an empty sports bottle and gave it to me because he said I had a spiritual blockage that he wanted to clear. So I was supposed to drink that and then throw it all up, which I told him I didn't want to do. So he instead told me that I could put a drop on my hand, pat it around my face, put a drop in each shoe, and then I needed to talk out loud to the bottle and tell it what I wanted, I guess, out of life, or what I was trying to do, what my intentions were, and then I needed to beat my chest and say, I must lead, I must be in charge. And I was supposed to do that more regularly because I think it's apparently less effective than just throwing up all at once, but it was preferable. So in my experience, like I said, I received readings from both the Inyangas and the Sangomas. A reading, generally, you go into, it'll be maybe a back room in someone's house. The best healers you find all through word of mouth and through recommendation. They're not the ones who are advertising. And both of them had me essentially dump a bag of seashells and dominoes and various items on the floor, and then they gave me a psychic reading and a reading about what's going on with me spiritually and what my spiritual ancestors are telling them. It seemed to me that they were certainly very good at reading you in the present. I don't want to say for certain none of them can read the future. I can't actually prove that. But the more specific they got, the more verifiably wrong they got. So the Inyanga started telling me about my girlfriend at the time, which he didn't ask if I had a girlfriend. He just started telling me. But then he said, there's something wrong with her left leg. And I texted her, and she said, no, my left leg is fine. But they are very good at reading what you respond to, subtle facial cues, and really getting at your deep issues right away. So it's actually kind of intense because you talk to them like you would a psychotherapist in the West, but you see them with the frequency with which you would see a medical doctor. So they need to get to your deepest issue right away so you can fix it. So you meet someone and you are talking out loud about whatever the deepest thing they can find and dig into right away. It's like if you walked into your therapist's office for the first time and they said, you clearly have mother issues, or something like that. And we need to go right at that because it's not a weekly thing that you keep seeing them for. So when they talked to me, they discussed my calling spiritually and what some things that were going on in my life short term, but they said it was more important to talk to me about my long-term trajectory. And actually the Sangoma told me that I had latent psychic abilities and wanted me to move in with her for 2 months so that she could train me and initiate me to be a Sangoma myself. So anyone can actually be a Sangoma or a Nyanga. You just have to be called, and you'll know if you're called by having dreams, or the spirits will talk to you somehow. As I pried a little more, I realized they were skimming over the fact that I would have had to break up with my girlfriend and sacrifice some animals in the process to do so as some of the rituals. And when I pressed them on that, they basically said, like, what, were you scared? Like, are you chicken? And I said, well, I didn't say this, but if I had actually cut open some animals and worn them, yes, I would have been chicken, quite literally, because... all right, so on to Australia. Like I said, I'm going to talk about Aboriginal healing a little bit less, but more in a general view, not on the individual level. So the Aboriginal people have a really cool, holistic view of health and wellness. Everything is connected within the individual, so your emotions, your thoughts, the physicality, it's all connected, and then it's all about really network and connections on the community level. So it's not about having the single mom who plays every role for her son and is, part-time doctor, part-time teacher, everything. It's really about, it takes a village, and so working together as a community that way. And where I said that spiritual ancestors have special significance in South Africa, the land has significance in Australia for Aboriginal people. And it's not that, they certainly actually also talk about their ancestors and the spirits, but their specific land, someone explained it to me this way. He said, if I'm born and then they bury my placenta in the ground and it helps grow into a tree, I am part of the land. And so he said, if they come in to mine our land, that's like, for a Christian, someone going up to heaven and tearing down the gates at the front and saying, I need the iron that's underneath this. So it's the land is spiritual, and it's about that specific land that they're from. So if you're taking care of them, moving them to the fanciest house in Melbourne isn't actually going to help because you're still removing them from their culture. So when you talk about trauma with Aboriginals, on a general level, you're talking about historical and generational trauma, and that will manifest itself in different ways as the cycle continues through generations and differently with different people. But generally, a lot of the solutions involve reconnecting with culture, so reconnecting with your land, reclaiming language that you may never have learned because of the stolen generation, and just generally trying to reconnect with your whole community. So in my experience, the fact that Aboriginal people are still around today after 40,000 years, including multiple attempts at genocide towards them, means clearly they must know something and they must be doing something right. So there's definitely some wisdom there. This is not one of my areas of strength of depth, like I was saying. But I did hear, and I am going to put a link up to my blog I've been keeping all year about this journey at the end. I did hear more stories about magic, and I heard from an Aboriginal elder a prediction of the end of the world. And I also, in Australia, this wasn't an Aboriginal man, but he was a shaman, and I learned about shamanic healing. And he told me a lot of cool stuff, and then by the end, among other things, helped me remove the invisible alien technology that had been implanted on me. So if you want to read those stories in full, I'll give the link to my blog at the end. All right, on to traditional Chinese medicine. So Chinese medicine health is defined by balanced qi flow throughout your body. And in Chinese medicine, generally, labels do not matter. They care about what are your individual and specific symptoms. And in that way, Chinese medicine actually, I think, has advantages over Western medicine sometimes for things like autism spectrum disorder, because every person is looked at differently. We're not saying, oh, they're all kind of this and along this spectrum. It's these are your symptoms, and if this person has 3 out of the 4 same symptoms but a different one, it's irrelevant, and we're going to treat your specific symptoms. And in general with Chinese medicine, they have a results-oriented approach, so they observe what works, and they certainly try to understand it a little bit, but at a certain point they say, we understand it enough, we've seen this long enough that it works, and so we're just going to go with that. And so again, that allows sometimes bypassing all the problems with research and years of testing that happens in the West. I'm certainly not saying one is better than the other, but as I'm going to say at the end, I actually think Chinese and Western medicine can be really nice together, complementary. So this is where I'm going to get a little more in depth. There's obviously no bullets on this slide. You might think that's all there is. And yes, this symbol, the Dai Jing, literally represents all that there is. So the white part rising is yang, and the black part coming down is yin. And as you can see, everything is made up of yin and yang. Yin and yang is a framework you can think of through which you can view anything. So characteristics of yang are rising, expansive, outward. Characteristics of yin tend to be receiving, whereas the yang is giving, going inward. And so yang creates yin, yin creates yang. You can't have one without the other. And so take your body, for example. Parts of your body that are higher and more outward are more yang, and parts that are more inward, obviously, are more yin. But yin and yang is always relative. So my neck is more yin than my head because it's lower, but my neck is more yang than my chest because it's higher. And you can apply this framework to anything, and you'll see where I'm going with this in a second. Then there's what's known as the 3 treasures. And again, if I'm going too fast on all this information, it's because the full version takes literally 5,000 years. So again, I can stay afterwards for questions at the end for that extra half hour. So in Chinese medicine, they talk about the mind, which is known as the Shen. It's not the brain. So the brain is an organ, but they actually call it a special organ. And it's so special that we don't really talk about it. It's kind of on the side. There's the concept of the mind, which has 5 components to it, which I'll explain. And the Shen is considered to be totally abstract and ethereal up here. So it's the most yang. Then there's qi, which is energy. And qi is it's not like yin and yang where it's kind of a framework through which you can view things. Qi is real and you can feel it. It's not some kind of spiritual thing. Chinese medicine's not at all spiritual. It really is. Qi is, you cannot have Chinese medicine without the working assumption that qi actually exists. And then there's what's known as Jing, which is life essence. And Jing itself doesn't do anything, but Jing is pulled from and acted upon by qi to create more qi, to create everything. And it's stored in Chinese medicine in your kidneys, although note that's kidneys with a capital K, and I'll also explain what that means in a second. And you're supposed to live according to your Jing. So we are all born with a set amount of Jing, and you cannot get it back. You can buffer it. You have a certain amount of daily qi. So if you don't overuse your daily qi, you essentially preserve your Jing. But you start to use your Jing when you have a long day and you're tired after a long day at the conference, and then you are about to go to bed, and then your friends say, hey, you want to go out to a bar? And then you kind of really push to do that. That's when you're starting to tap into your Jing a little bit. I'm not saying you're going to die if you do that, but it's a long-term thing. It adds up over time. And so Jing is obviously the most yin. It's acted upon. It just sits there, whereas Shen is totally out there, like I said. So you can see the yin-yang framework on these. Then, this is my favorite part, there's the 5 elements, the Wuxing theory. And so the 5 elements, as you can see, fire, earth, metal, water, and wood. And every part of your life can be categorized into one of the elements. And this is what I think is really cool about this. So every element has a certain type of personality associated with it, has a body type associated with it. There are foods associated with every element, types of exercise. Literally, there's tones of voice that are associated with each element. And we all have all the elements in us. We might have a certain body type that tends more towards one element, but you think of it this way. It's not like a horoscope, like, oh, I'm a Taurus, you know, but my teacher says all the elements have their ankles shackled together and are running a relay race because it's a constant cycle, and you're always going through the cycle. So if you have one person or one element that's really slow and holding you down, that disrupts the whole cycle moving forward. And you can see, so fire leads into earth, as you can see. Fire would be known as mother of earth, and then earth would be known as son of fire. But then earth is mother of metal, and metal is son of earth. And then there's these arrows in between, which are called the control arrows. So fire creates earth, but wood controls earth and is supposed to keep it in check. And so where this starts to get really cool and interesting, as I was saying before, labels don't matter in Chinese medicine. It's all about what are your specific elemental imbalances. And so, for example, the earth element is associated with, and this is where it starts to get into trauma, the earth element is associated with feelings of security, feelings of mothering, feelings of home. So my teacher told me I had an earth imbalance because I've been traveling to many different countries for 11 months now. And then the metal element has to do with feelings of self-worth, self-esteem, security. Meanwhile, the wood element has to do with creativity, but the emotions also associated with these elements. Wood, when it's imbalanced, is associated with anger. Earth, when it's imbalanced, is associated with anxiety. And metal and more water is depression and coming inwards. So if you have someone who, say a foster kid, is constantly bouncing around and they don't feel like they have a home and they start to have an earth imbalance, well, earth is mother of metal, so if they have an earth imbalance, that can lead to anxiety. Earth is mother of metal, and metal can lead to issues with self-esteem and self-worth and rules and authority issues. The wood element, which is controlling earth, if the earth is imbalanced, it can do what's called, it insults its controller. So earth can go back and basically disrupt wood since it's disrupted, which can lead to things like anger. But what's cool about the way the elements are structured is if you affect an element, you affect the element. And because it's at every part of your life then, you can do so many different forms of therapy to address that imbalance. So if you have anger issues from the wood, wood is also associated with creativity. So when you write a song or do art therapy, you're taking that extra chi in the wood and redirecting it into some form of creativity to balance out your wood element. So you can see where, and then if you fix the wood and it can control the earth, you can see since how the whole cycle is related, the advantage of this is therapeutically, you can start at any point in the cycle to address these imbalances. There's also other relationships with the elements. This gets pretty complicated, but you can see in this diagram, the earth is in the middle. There's seasons of the year associated with each element, and they all have the same number of days, but the earth element is split into 4 quarters, and the earth quarters take place in between each of the other seasons. It's kind of the transition periods. Earth is the transition element, which is again why it has to do with when you constantly keep moving and don't have a home, you have an earth imbalance, which means transitions are not smooth and it can lead to anxiety. So that can lead to anytime there's changes, it can just cause a lot of disruption, and earth gets in the way of, even if your fire's okay and your metal's okay, it can cause disruption anytime there's a big change in your life. So Chinese medicine and trauma. Traumatic events scatter your chi. So remember, health is about smooth chi flow. Different emotions do different things. Anger is when your chi rises. Sadness is when your chi goes down and depresses. Traumatic events and scary things scatter your chi everywhere, and it's just frenetic, and you're really not centered. And they also tax the jing. So if you have an acutely traumatic experience, it can literally take years off your life because you lost some jing and you can't get it back, which is why maybe after a traumatic accident, you have to adjust and live according to your jing. They say if someone, has just not been the same since whatever event, that's generally an indicator that they lost a lot of jing in that event from Chinese medicine perspective. Like I said, the treatment is based on individual symptoms, so you can start at any point in the elemental cycle. And Chinese medicine does do surgery. Generally, nobody beats Western medicine for the ER and for surgeries and for acute, especially physical traumas or take a pill to kill this germ. But Chinese medicine approaches tend to be slow and steady, and because they're into labels and everything can change, Chinese medicine would say, in Western medicine we might say, I am a hemophiliac, I am this, or I have this. Chinese medicine would say, maybe we can change that. And it would take a long time. My teacher said generally a guideline is for every year you've had something, it'll take at least a month of treatment. But it's a combination of slow and steady approaches for permanent change. And again, because the elements span across every area of your life, it's going to be a combination of practices, but and you want to do them all at the same time. So it's going to be energetic practices like qigong, meditation, exercise, eating foods according to your elemental imbalances, adjusting your sleep schedule, living according to the hours of the day that have to do with different elements, really every part of your life. So there's me doing qigong in India with my shiatsu, of course, looking like a cult a little bit. So in my experience, generally it works. Any of these practices can be taken. There are people who really take them to extremes and it gets kind of questionable. Some people say, it's not even just what foods, but if a food is shaped a certain way, it affects a certain element. And, I'm not going to say yes or no, but generally I actually found Chinese medicine to be really cool. And the interrelatedness of every part of your life through the element theory is really empowering, I found. Because if I'm having some kind of issue, if I struggle with anxiety, suddenly this won't be the main cure, but I feel like I can make decisions to help myself when I choose what to eat in the buffet, when I choose how to adjust my sleep schedule, when I choose what type of exercise to do. So suddenly I feel like I am helping myself and I feel empowered to make very conscious decisions. And like I said, I don't need to necessarily confront my specific source of anxiety directly, or even the earth element directly. If it's anxiety, I could balance out the other elements and in that way try to help myself. And worst case scenario, even if none of this, even if you don't believe any of this, you're still eating better and exercising and sleeping better. So like I said before, Chinese medicine is a potentially extremely effective ally for Western medicine, but I wouldn't substitute either one and say totally this one or totally this one. Now, I learned all of this theory in the context of a Zen Shiatsu course. Actually, if you look in the background on the door, there's some of the diagrams that I just showed you. Zen Shiatsu is a style of Japanese massage, and it works on the assumptions and the premises of Chinese medicine. So think of the whole body as a closed system of qi, and it's like a river. And when you get an imbalance or when you're stressed, that's rocks piling up in the river. And when that happens, the water level is higher at some places and it's lower at other places. And so you have imbalances of qi, you have qi stagnation, different things like that. So those are known as kyos and jitsus. Qi deficient areas are known as kyos, and then qi excessive areas are known as jitsus. And you generally work on the kyos because the jitsus don't want to be touched. They're a little testy. So you work along the energetic meridians in the body that are associated with the elements. I'll explain that in the next slide, sorry. But if you just find the biggest kyo, you can have the biggest impact on the body because you filled up the biggest deficient point, and since it's a closed system, obviously that means you pulled from somewhere else. And so that's the general theory of shiatsu. And you do it through the clothes. You don't do shiatsu with your clothes off. You can, but because actually as a practitioner we're focusing on the sensations of the qi, we're not actually focusing on your body. It still feels nice physically and relaxes the muscles, but the goal of the body work is actually to work on the qi. So these are in Chinese medicine. Remember I said before about the capital organs. These are the 12 organs. And Chinese medicine does acknowledge that there are other organs in the body. Like I said, the brain is a special organ. There's, your skin is considered an organ by Chinese doctors for day-to-day purposes. But these are, when you're talking about qi, these are the 12 organs. And in case you were wondering, the triple warmer is essentially a general collection of homeostatic mechanisms. So if you had to pinpoint the triple warmer to a specific organ, it would likely be some combination of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, but it generally has to do with heat regulation and other processes like that in the body. And each of these organs, capital O, is associated with an element, and they're associated in pairs. And each of those pairs, one is yin and one is yang. So you can see how this all ties together. So the green line along the side of this woman is obviously her gallbladder, if you weren't thinking that already. But it's in green, actually, I think probably intentional. The gallbladder is the yang wood element organ. And so that is your gallbladder meridian, which you can see it goes along the side of the head. If you're dealing with migraines as a shiatsu therapist, first of all, the fact that you're dealing with migraines would tell me to look for wood element imbalances. And then second of all, I could work on your wood meridian to address, you can see along the side of the head like I was saying, address those. And then that would also, like I said, possibly impact creativity, help you with anger, other things associated with the wood element. So Zen Shiatsu and trauma, you would just do the same body work as always. Touch can be an issue for some people. So I've heard tales of, some people, if they're coming from an accident, really don't like to be touched. Just sitting with them or sitting, just making contact, not using your hands, but just sitting with your kind of body just next to them can be enough touch for them. You want appropriate dosing for working their way back up. And like traditional Chinese medicine, because it's applying the same principles, you're not concerned about the specific diagnosis of the person, but rather you do a qi reading of the person just to find their specific imbalances, and then you work along the physical meridians, which are associated with the organs, which are associated with the elements, and that's where you're finding the imbalances. And one of the big advantages of this and of the elemental model is you can address someone's deepest problems without talking about them at all. So, like I said, if you have a really deep traumatic issue that caused, again, say a wood imbalance, then I can still pick that up based on maybe if you wake up every night at the same time and those are maybe the wood hours, or if you are having migraines. I can pick up from other things that you say that you have a wood imbalance. And again, if I affect the element, I affect the element. So you don't need to tell me and go into your whole your whole story with me, especially if you just met me and if that's a hard thing to do, which is really cool. And again, why shiatsu and body work can also be used in conjunction with therapy, like with a talk therapist. So in my experience, shiatsu has really powerful short-term effects. It can really knock you out. And when someone finds a kyo, you might fall asleep or essentially feel like you're passing out for just a few minutes, and then when they move off that spot, there's crazy things that have happened. I've seen when someone really finds a kyo, that spot. Someone has, they're totally fine. I was actually working on my teacher, and I found a huge kyo, and she went into a coughing fit and had to get up and get water, even though it was right here on her arm, and this spot didn't do it, and this spot didn't do it. But you can really feel the qi and feel things moving in your body. It's difficult to isolate the long-term effects of body work like this, and ideally you almost wouldn't want to, because you would also be adjusting things like nutrition, exercise, and making a collective effort to help yourself in this way. But over time, if you continually get these qi readings through shiatsu, it can help you learn imbalances you tend towards. So even if you're not dealing with a huge traumatic event, it can still help you find balance in your life in this way. And I will say, reorganizing doesn't always feel great at the time. And to the earlier bullet point, you can also give someone a treatment they don't need. So as the shiatsu practitioner, and I'll contrast this with Reiki later, you are directing the qi and working specific meridians. So you can work, for example, all of someone's yang meridians and work their fire meridians. Now, as I said later, anger is when the qi rises. So you would never just work all of someone's yang meridians rise their chi and then get up and say, wasn't that a relaxing massage? Because you just brought all of their chi up. So you want to find balance. And when we were taking the class, we didn't learn by giving each other proper treatments. We learned by doing one meridian over and over and over. So some days I really felt terrible because it was maybe a meridian I didn't need, and someone would work on it for me 6 times in a row that day. Other days it felt really awesome if it was addressing an imbalance that I needed. But even when you do it well, reorganizing it's still a change, it's still a transition, so it can really knock you out for a day or two. You might have emotions come up because you have this chi moving around, which is again associated on physical and emotional levels. All right, so moving on, and again, I can take a lot of questions at the end because I know I went a little more in depth. Ayurveda. So Ayurveda is Indian. It's from Kerala specifically. It's thousands of years old. I actually went to Sri Lanka to learn about it because I didn't have as much time, and I found a intensive resort where you could get personalized Ayurvedic treatment plan for the week, and you had 24 access to Ayurvedic doctors, so I was able to talk to them that way. So the general theory of Ayurveda, and I'll say from the beginning, if you just Google Ayurveda, it'll say it's a pseudoscience to begin with. The main idea is to balance out the 3 bioenergies, which are Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And unlike with the elements, everyone has all 3 energies, but you have a primary energy that's permanent. And these are known as your doshas, by the way. So Vata, Pitta, and Kapha are the 3 doshas. And your doshas change at a slower pace than chi. So I can really move a lot of chi around in just one shiatsu treatment. But it might take, when I checked in at the start of the week and at the end of the week, and they said, yeah, you made a little bit of change in your bioenergies, but you would probably actually need to come for maybe a few weeks to really address the imbalances that you have at the moment. And the general principles of Ayurveda are nutrition based on your doshas. It's mostly nutrition and a lot of work with herbs, just getting a lot of rest and getting massages, but the herbs will be in the oils in the massage, the herbs will be in the tea you have with lunch, the herbs will be in the cooking. Ayurveda for trauma, it's not for emergencies. There are, like I said, Ayurvedic doctors who go to medical school or Ayurvedic medical school for 6 years, but if there is an emergency, they call in a Western doctor. It's more a long-term, balanced, restorative approach to your whole life. So consistency is key. So like I said, for Ayurveda and trauma, sorry about the divorce, here's the salad, and if you eat enough of them over time, you'll start to feel better generally. But that's not essentially what it's used for. In my experience, I actually found Ayurveda to be a bit disappointing. I had heard a lot of positive anecdotes about it from other yoga teacher friends, but here's the story. So I attended a yoga class at the Ayurvedic retreat center that I was at, and I did cobra pose, bhujangasana, where I put the forearms of my mat on the dirty mat that they had supplied to me. And when I left, I suddenly had a rash on both of my arms. I didn't figure this out at first, so I went to one of the Ayurvedic doctors and said, what do you think this rash is on my arm? And they said, well, sometimes that happens because that's actually the toxins working their way out of your body as they bubble to the surface and then kind of dissipate. So he was saying it was these deep toxins, and I wasn't totally buying that, especially when I remembered the yoga class where the only part of my skin that had really touched the mat was exactly where I had the rash. And additionally, every time I slept, it got better. And every time a, frankly, pretty hairy man gave me an oil massage, it actually started to get worse again. So the Ayurveda didn't seem to be helping. So I went to a second Ayurvedic doctor who, again, went to 6 years of Ayurvedic medical school and had a huge chart on the wall of an ear with all the anatomy labeled to prove that she was a doctor. And I said, I have this rash, and she didn't even look at it. She just said, yeah, well, it's pretty hot outside today. So that was the consultation I got from 2 Ayurvedic doctors. Again, my experience was limited. It's been around for 5,000 years, so I don't want to totally knock it, but that was my experience. And so in my opinion, it was called pseudoscience for a reason. But if you, again, eat well and sleep and get massages, you'll still feel better at the end of a week. I mean, I did. So I just don't think it was because of the herbs and the specifically Ayurvedic parts of that week. I think had I slept and eaten vegetables anywhere, I would have felt better at the end of a week. All right, so Reiki in Japan. the general principle of Reiki is you are sending universal life force energy to people. And that energy, unlike Qi, you're just a channel for the energy. So it works on the premise that everything is made up of this energy, and we'll call this Reiki energy. And all that you do in Reiki is you place your hands on or near someone. You don't even have to be touching them to be doing it. So it's not like Shiatsu where, Shiatsu literally means finger pressure. You use your thumbs generally and you push a lot. Well, you lean, sorry. My teacher would get mad if I said push. But with Reiki, you're just putting your hands on or near someone and trusting that the Reiki energy is flowing through you as a channel and into them, and you're trusting it to go where it needs to do as if it has a mind of its own and to purify them. Anyone can practice Reiki. There is, in Japan, a more secretive society of the really, really traditional Reiki, and they don't really let people in, and you have to speak Japanese. But you can learn Reiki anywhere in the world, and that is generally structured in 3 levels. So I flew to Vancouver from Tokyo on my way here. I just received my Reiki level 2 the last week of May. And so what an attunement does is it opens up your Reiki channels so that you can channel and direct Reiki energy. Anyone can receive it, but to send it to people and to direct it, you need to have an attunement to open up your Reiki channels. And Reiki energy can also be sent, this makes sense logically based on the premise that the entire universe is energy. Reiki energy can be sent over long distance to people. It can actually be sent to animals, or to plants, to objects. My teacher said that one time her camera died, so she pulled out the battery and did Reiki on it for a minute and then put it back in and took like 5 more photos before it died again. So Reiki as applied to trauma, for others, it mostly helps them feel better now. And again, you're kind of trusting that the Reiki energy has a mind of its own. So you're just sending generally good intentions to them and positive Reiki energy, but you're not saying, I want it to work this meridian. You're just saying, just help balance this person right now. But you can do Reiki for yourself towards the past. Like I said, you can send Reiki towards the future to send good intentions towards the situation in the future or the way you feel. And you can send Reiki over distance to someone else. My teacher said you usually only do Reiki towards the past for yourself as a practitioner. But it was really interesting to me how much it actually started to tie in some psychotherapy concepts. So you write out a physical narrative of some traumatic or anxious memory that you're trying to work on. And then you use that, you always use some form of surrogate. So if I'm sending Reiki to someone over distance, I might get a picture of them. In this case, you use the written narrative as the surrogate, and you perform Reiki with your hands on that narrative, and then you sit with it and essentially meditate and walk through this memory in your head. And she talked about as well, she used the phrase inner child specifically. She said if you have to take a break, if it's too intense, or if you just have to take a break, you say to your inner child, it's okay, I'll be back later. But in essence, what you're doing, in addition to sending the Reiki energy, is you are finding a safe space to walk through a narrative of a painful memory, which is actually very similar to Western psychotherapy. Now, in my experience, Reiki, contrasted with Ayurveda, I felt a lot in general. It was surprisingly powerful. And I say this because I cannot defend this with science of any kind at all. Technically, Reiki, you can call me on the phone and I can heal your cat with energy from another continent, which makes it sound ridiculous. Although my teacher said, she's like, yeah, technically the logical extreme, you could do it over the phone internationally. She said, I never do that. But that's again, if you wanted to take any of these practices to the extreme. But when I received an attunement, there's what they call a 21-day cleansing period where your energy kind of reorganizes and sorts itself out and cleanses you after you receive the attunement. I had to sleep a lot. I had all kinds of emotions coming up, which did actually more feel like things bubbling out to the surface. And again, Reiki started in 1922 by a man whose last name was Reiki, and he literally went up to a mountain and meditated and then came down kind of like Moses with the 10 Commandments and said, here's Reiki, and he started teaching it. So it's one of the practices this year which has actually been one of the most pleasant surprises because it sounds the most kind of mystical or unfounded in science and theory we're familiar with in the West. But I also would be lying if I said I didn't feel something. And so even if it's all placebo, because the problems it's dealing with are generally sort of in your head, I'll take a placebo solution, which is all in your head. You wouldn't necessarily, you could do Reiki for a cut, but again, this is more for emotional and spiritual well-being. So some final thoughts, and I'm actually doing way better on time than I thought. I'll have a lot of time for questions. Every culture has some form of healing, and really we're all dealing with the same problems. I never went to any country where they weren't familiar with a problem. I wasn't necessarily familiar with the solutions that they had, and everyone has different approaches to this. Some people, we don't go that much into dream interpretation in the West, but in South Africa that's really an emphasis. So it's different ways of dealing with essentially the same issues. In my experience this year, having talked to a lot of people, I'm not a therapist, but having talked to all these people who are getting into healing, but obviously working with people and healing themselves, the people who are doing the best are the ones who do not spend all of their time healing. You heal to get back to your life. And so it's the people who, even though they had horrible things happen to them, it's the people who are continuing with their life rather than spending all of their time trying to repair and get back to their life that actually seem to be doing the best and not the most usually depressed because they're not just focusing on the past and the loss. Obviously you want to get through it, as not get over it, but get through it, as someone was saying in the last session I was in. But it's those people who spend some of their time healing and some of their time actually living, which is the ultimate goal of the healing. And another observation, like I said, with all of these practices, even if some of them really seem to work and some of them don't, they're really all basic variations on you should sleep, diet, exercise, and I'll say meditate. Dr. Eblon was talking about how regulation is contagious and dysregulation is also contagious. If you as a healer want to learn how to have the discipline to stay regulated, meditation is really the way to go, I think. It does things, it's not sleep, even if you fall asleep sometimes. But in general, even if you don't know anything about any of these practices, even if you don't know the exercises that are specific maybe to the elemental imbalance that you're going for, if you just exercise and use your body, if you eat well, if you sleep, and like I said, if you meditate, you'll certainly feel better than you would if you weren't doing all of those things. So I wanted to leave you with some final thoughts. These are known as the Reiki Gokai. They're the 5 principles of Reiki, and I liked them as applied to trauma because they start with just for today. So obviously you can tell yourself this every day, and you want to do it every day. These are long-term goals. But you don't say in the beginning, like we say in some yoga meditations, I am loving awareness now and forever. That's such a lofty, kind of unspecific goal. And if you can do that, awesome. But I like this for, don't worry about the past. Just for today, don't be angry, don't worry, be grateful, work hard, and be kind to others. And then don't worry about tomorrow. Tell yourself again tomorrow and try to do it again then. So my information, and this is a painting I found in South Africa, in Cape Town, just on the side. That is my blog up at the top, like I said, which has just general reflections from this year. And like I said, more information on all these topics, links to some of them, and the long-form versions of a lot of these stories. Like if you want to hear about, and actually I have time to tell some of these stories now, if you want to hear about things like my experience with the shaman, like I said, or if you're interested in learning more about any of these topics. And then that is my personal email underneath that if you want to contact me with questions. But I actually I think I got excited and talked really fast. So I have a lot of time to answer questions now, and I'm happy to stay afterwards too if people want to talk. But I know it's the last session, so if you want to go, here's my gift to you. So.
Can you show the other formal page?
To show the other...
Formal...
This? Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
So when you were in South Africa, you said that you saw 2 practitioners. What were they called again?
So I saw multiple, but the 2 types, and I got a reading from each, was an Inyanga and a Sangoma.
Okay, so I wanted to know, for you personally, was there similarities between the reading from both?
Yeah, there was. I wasn't going to go too personal into what we talked about, but they were generally on the same topics, although they somewhat intentionally changed their focus. The Inyanga talked to me a little more immediately about what was going on. The Sangoma, who ultimately told me she wanted me to move in with her so she could train me, she said, there are things going on with you right now, but I think it's more important for you to discuss your calling in the long term. So she intentionally skipped some of those, my girlfriend's left leg and some of those specifics to talk to me about where I should go with my whole life in general. But some of the themes were the same, and like I said, it's not all 100% picking up on the spiritual energy. Some of it is reading me and my personality in the moment, so yeah. Yes, sorry.
I'm just interested, did you do any talking with any of these healers about trauma, about generational trauma in children and like essentially the topics of that?
In Australia, I didn't have the opportunity as much to talk specifically with the Ngangkari. Is usually, you sound like you're from Australia, I think, yeah. But we, I had a lot of conversations generally about people's individual experiences. With some of these other healers, I did ask my Shiatsu teacher about trauma, but I was with her for 4 months. So, but no, it wasn't usually the focus. I actually didn't know I was doing this conference until about 2 months ago. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Do you have any chance, or have you explored at all homeopathic within the healing pieces of this?
Not really. It's a term I'm vaguely familiar with, but I can't say I know that much about it. Yeah.
I want to know kind of how you found these people, just because sometimes as an outsider coming in, how much they saw you as kind of oh, we can make some money off this person, right? With some of the things that you said that they told you, right? Like about the invisible alien.
Yeah, actually, he talked to me for over 2 hours, and I tried to pay him, and he wouldn't let me at the end. He said, I'm paying it forward, and he said, if you're going to be talking about healing, this was the shaman I was in Perth. He said, he was a really nice guy. He said, I want you to take this forward and share it with people. Other people in South Africa, you have to be careful with the healers because it's become its own industry. People are coming in from other countries who aren't South African, and other African countries have their own similar healers, but there's 13 official languages in South Africa, so there's all different kinds of healers. And there are sangomas on the street passing out flyers to enlarge certain organs and things like that. So those aren't the ones you go to. I hired a guide and translator in South Africa, but it's been different in every country. I was talking to you earlier about how to talk to a First Nation elder in Canada, you offer tobacco usually. In South Africa, because I basically, through word of mouth is how you find it. You don't find the ones who advertise. So I found someone who could translate for me and who knew people. And then, but in other countries, in Australia, I found they either really wanted to talk to me. The difference being the Aboriginal population is 3% of the population in Australia. In South Africa, the black population is the majority of the population. So I was able to just, you don't necessarily pay them like a specific charge, but they just call it an offering, like I am thanking you, and so here's a generally appropriate amount of money. In Australia, people either didn't want to talk to me because they didn't trust white people just showing up and saying, I want to know, or they were really grateful that someone was finally listening to them, and someone even gave me a gift for listening to them. In India, it was a class, so I found it kind of a sketchy website, but it ended up working out. In Japan, Japan, it's a first world country enough that I could look for English-speaking Reiki teachers online. But some of these people I vet beforehand, so I received a treatment before I signed up for any attunements from this person to check them out. So, yeah, you sign up, and if you just show up, and if you're open and nice to people and just listen and don't come across like you're trying to exploit this. I wasn't, I'm not doing this to promote my career at this conference. I'm doing this because I want to share this information. People respond to that and respond to the tone. Yes?
Is it not difficult for you, after all this kind of therapists, to choose the one best therapist for yourself?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of choosing the one best necessarily. I think for me, what's cool is seeing where these overlap and where these integrate. And so you find maybe what works for you in each of them. I know some people who swear by Ayurveda, and like I said, I had heard a lot of positive anecdotes about it first. Like, I had cancer and I tried this treatment and it didn't work, So I tried everything, and long-term Ayurveda really, by 10 years, extended the life expectancy of this person. It didn't work for me, and some of these practices even say that. And with things like Reiki, they say, we're sending positive energy. We're not actually sure exactly what it's going to do, but it'll help. It's not going to hurt, but I can't promise with Reiki a specific outcome like I can go for in Shiatsu by directing your chi in a specific way. But I'm definitely going to need a lot of time to process this year. Yeah, I'm excited to go home and keep writing and keep thinking, because I mean, just this morning, I mean, new input coming in constantly, which is all awesome and exciting, but it's a lot to think about. So if you want to see my thoughts as they slowly come in, you can check out my blog again. Like I said, there's that information.
So what's the expectation with your research now? What would your honest grant, what do you have to do with this?
It's a pretty sweet deal, honestly.
How did you get it? Let's start with that.
Okay, so I applied for, in the U.S., what is known nationally as the Watson Fellowship, which, as opposed to a Fulbright sends you to one country and invests in the relationship between two countries and focuses on the research you're doing. The Watson Fellowship is focusing on the individual. They say, you seem like a high potential individual. We want you to pursue your passion, but also develop yourself as a person. I actually did not get the Watson Fellowship. I was a finalist for it. And then my university, who had nominated me for this national fellowship, internally funded me because they liked me and I got close enough, essentially, which is why Professor Zeff and Rice University are the ones funding this year. I actually don't have any explicit research requirements or publications that I have to do out of this year, but the screening process at the beginning is they find people who want to do these things. You know, I wanted to give this talk here, so, and like I said, I'm keeping my blog. So. Yeah, it's a good deal, honestly. I'm humbled by it, and so I want to share as much as I can. Yes?
I was curious, how come you didn't share about your experiences within Western Indigenous peoples?
So one of the conditions of the fellowship is you cannot be in America. You can be anywhere in the world except for America. And I just got to Canada 7 days ago for this conference, so I actually don't have those experiences yet. I'm finally over my 16 hours of jet lag from Tokyo. So I saw more hands. Yeah.
I heard you mention the South African cultures had a focus on ancestors, right? But aside from those, none of them that you mentioned have any sort of, I didn't hear anything of relational context to these things. Do any of those modalities focus on relationships or your relational context as the context for healing?
Not so explicitly, but I think in the same way that, you know, cognitive behavioral therapy isn't explicitly as a technique about the relationship between your therapist and the client, but that helps and is the biggest predictor. You know, you can do Reiki shares, and for example with Reiki, if I'm going to send it to someone over distance, I'm still supposed to get informed consent, because we're treating it like I'm giving someone, you know, a massage. You can't just come up and start massaging someone you barely know. So in that sense, there is trust and there is a relationship. And like I said, the ancestors in Africa, that's a part of the culture as well. And in places like Australia, there was also, a lot of these things are part of the culture and not necessarily just the explicit healing technique. But in Australia, you know, you're receiving, it's such a community network. So there's a lot about the relationship built in. But as I'm trying to hone in on the theoretical connection between the mind and the body, that's intrapersonal. So. Anyone else? Great. Well, here's my blog and again my email, and I can say afterwards to talk to people. So thank you guys for coming.